and and then, I mean, going back to perhaps the principle on which some of this is based, is the question of, I mean, how do we agree that there is a reality out there that we're all getting at? And I mean, I suppose this comes back to the issue we were discussing earlier, in that there might be cases in which there's a fundamental conflict in beliefs, perhaps, or a fundamental conflict in desires, and that seems okay to me. I mean, I have less expertise in that area, but what can we agree on? And it seems to me that at least there are, and I don't even like using the term facts because it's so often used in sketchy contexts, I think. But I mean, what are the things that we can agree on about how the world works? I mean, I think we may all have, suppose, Emlen, you don't believe in God, Bruce, you believe in God, and I believe in Martians. I mean, if that's what we all believe, it doesn't really matter if we can all agree that rockets can go to the moon, right? And there's evidence for that, and there's also conspiracy theories around that. So, I mean, what is the fundamental belief, and how do we come to that fundamental belief that there's a truth out there that we can measure, and that the difficult conversations, the debates, the asking of questions, and all of that is surrounded, is all getting at the idea of trying to figure out what the truth is. I mean, how do you even talk about that or define it? And as you can see, I'm certainly struggling with that without using terms that are, I think, often misused.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real challenge, and that's one of the things that I'm sort of maybe more optimistic than Bruce, that the talk it out strategy can at least help with somewhat. That you figure out, okay, well, maybe we don't agree about everything, but are there fundamental ideas about reality that we do agree on? Okay, do we agree that that there is a reality outside our minds? Do we agree that do I believe that you are a person with a mind of your own, with your own beliefs? Yeah, I do. I hope that you believe that of me too. Okay, well, that's a good starting place. Let's move on from there. Hopefully we can get further than that. Okay, do we believe that I don't know, humans are capable of learning new information? Seems like there's a lot of evidence for that. Hopefully we can all agree about that. Okay. And then going from sort of a common ground of, okay, we share reality, at least up to a point, then maybe we can work a bit further. And maybe one, this is a strategy I haven't tried out, but I like to think that insofar as we can agree that there's a reality out there that we share, and we're all trying to represent it accurately. Maybe we have other goals in our beliefs too, but accuracy is one of our beliefs, at least. Then, and that our representations are imperfect. So there's this reality, we all share the same reality in some kind of sense, but our representations are imperfect, and they're probably imperfect in different ways. That's all you need to get to a point that we can learn something by talking to each other. Does that mean we can persuade each other? Not necessarily. Does that mean we can come to agreement about what to do? Not necessarily. But it's a starting place, at least. And then we can start to figure out, okay, well, what is true about this reality that we share, and what are the differences in our perceptions? Where might those differences come from? Can we resolve them? Maybe not, but at least it's worth a try. And then approaching it as maybe like an investigator, or curious. How do you see the world? What do you think? What is the world? How does this work? What's going on here? Can be really, really powerful, actually, and often more powerful than the more powerful, dominating mode of, I have this vision of the world that is correct, and I need to persuade everyone else to agree with me so that they'll do the things that I think that they should do. Because that, that's a very tempting way of thinking of things, but it's often not super effective.
Yeah.
So Emlen, can I jump in again? So I agree with everything you're saying. I think it's easy for us to agree because we're all scientists, and you're framing everything you're saying is framed in a sort of in a familiar way to a scientist. I'm not so. Let me set up where I think there's a procedural gap between the solution. We could call it, maybe I should call it a chronological gap. There's a chronological gap between your solution and a prior problem, and you're probably aware of this, but I'm sort of asking you how we can solve the prior problem. So let me explain. So we as scientists, we have the default, we should, so not all scientists are like this, so that's a different problem, but we should have a default position of looking at the evidence and looking at the methodologies, looking at the qualities of the evidence, which is qualities of the original data. We can have a back and forth, which allows us to fine tune the evidence or our understanding. So we have a default position of dialogue, and we are comfortable as scientists in the dialogue being somewhat confrontational. So we can say, I don't think your method is right, or, have you tried this, or have you compared this other data set? And that can be somewhat confrontational. Now, the prior problem I see is that people are assuming opinions as facts. So this circles back to what Aditya is saying, that, and we've talked about in previous episodes, that the public discourse has started to use terms in problematic ways. So they will refer to hearsay as fact. They will refer to consensus as fact, and they'll refer to their preferred opinions as facts. So I think this is let's illustrate this. So I read, this was on Yahoo. So this is just to make it clear, this is a very real example, and it upset me, right? So there was a news article on Yahoo saying, here's a list of all the films or TV shows that are racist, and this is so there are lots of news articles or opinion pieces coming out as a reaction to Black Lives Matter. And the protests against police violence. And this Yahoo article made a list of all the things that are racist. And it was written by a Yahoo marketing manager or something. Right? So not written by a scientist, not written by anybody with, so far as I can see, anybody with qualifications to decide what is racist or not. And it was just a list of, this is obviously racist, this is obviously racist, this is obviously racist. No evidence, no logic, in fact, no argument. There was just no argument in here. So this illustrates a prior problem. We cannot, a person like that is not offering any room for discourse. She said, actually, this writer is putting out, this is true, I don't have to argue it, I don't have to source it. This is somebody who doesn't understand science or doesn't care to admit, but she is writing outside of science, even if she understands science. Now, this is very common in social media, though people are saying, but it just is. It just is. Now, I think that is a prior problem to the scientific solutions we are discussing, because I don't know how, if somebody's going to take that position that that there's just things that are just true because, I don't know, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just they're just true. They're just true. It's it upsets me, and it really worries me, because it's outside of science, and science, I don't think a scientific method can solve it. So you've probably thought about this. What this is really putting you on the spot. Do you have a solution to this?
So my first instinct is I have a question for that person. I mean, people make statements without arguments all the time in science too, and in the academy, and that's fine. They just need to be ready for a question. So I want to ask that person, what do you mean when you call something racist? What does that mean? What are you saying? I just want to understand what the claim is that you're making. And then hopefully she's willing to say, when I call something racist, I mean, it maybe supports ways of thinking that put down Black and brown people.
She would have to define it.
Or whatever, get her to define it in some way, and then we can wrestle with the definition together, and we can wrestle with how well the definition applies to her list together, and that can mean, okay, why did you choose this? Okay, what's the racist element in this, and so on and so on. So I actually don't think it's necessarily a problem that people are sometimes making statements without arguments. That's probably always going to happen. The problem would be if they refuse to engage in any kind of questions. Now, I will say that I have come across, even in academia, people who refuse to define their terms, which is extremely frustrating. And at the point that someone says, I can't define it, because if I defined it, then like you're just supposed to know what it means, or if I've defined it, then it would give you the wrong idea. I mean, I guess I'm demonstrating here that I don't quite understand the refusal to define something that if you're making a declaration, you're saying X is Y. You say, well, what does it mean to say that X is Y? Oh, I can't tell you that. Well, then what are we talking about here? So and there are sort of methodological things, like you were saying, that scientists and often academics are trained to think in particular ways, like to engage in dialogue, as you said, to ask questions, to be ready to answer questions. And going back to sort of earlier in the conversation, I think that's exactly what we need everyone to be ready to do. We don't need people to memorize all the facts about what happened on what dates, or the different parts of what the different bones are called in the body. I mean, all that is good information to have, but we really, really need to have the people in our society be able to engage in dialogue. And you know what, that does take training, that takes practice, and we're not necessarily giving that to our students in our schools. So one sort of pet idea that I have that's just I haven't had an opportunity to try yet is to replace essay assignments with dialogue assignments. So students are very frequently, starting in like 6th grade, told to write an essay. You say, okay, take a position and argue for it. The problem with this, it's good practice developing argumentation and writing and a thought and so on, but it forces students to take a position on an issue that they haven't thought about very much. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is actually not a great precedent to set. And there's an easy alternative. Just have them write a dialogue between 2 characters with 2 different positions that forces you to explore both sides. And it's also a little bit more fun because you have this back and forth. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of little things like that we can do in the education system to help everyone be ready to actually engage in dialogue and answer questions. And when you're in the habit of engaging in dialogue, then I think you're less likely potentially to, in an article especially, make some claim without explaining it, because it's going to be more salient. What are the questions that people are going to have? Like, what do you mean when you call something racist?
Yeah, but let me qualify this, right? So I'm not saying you're not aware of this, but saying your prescription of dialogue could get us back to the talk it outism problem, right? So so I would have to qualify your prescription by saying, let's train people in defining things, say, before we prescribe they should go out in dialogue, because otherwise the dialogue could just be, you know, what do you believe? I don't believe that. End of dialogue. Or you know, if we were having the dialogue with this Yahoo marketing manager or whatever she was, she her default would not change if we just say, so why is this racism? It just is. It's obvious, right? This actually is a very common form of dialogue with people of that ilk, which it just is. It's just obvious. It's self-evident. Mm-hmm. Everybody says so. Yeah. I know it is. I don't, or I can't explain it to you. I just know it is, right? So mm-hmm. if we are not taking the posture, look, we need to define things first. Tell me how you define racism. If we can't get past that point, it just becomes talk it outism, and it doesn't go anywhere unless the other side or both sides say, well, okay, if you say it's the consensus, then I'm just going to join the consensus, because if we're not talking it out, if we can't talk it out, maybe I assume it's my problem, and therefore you must be right. So, you know, again, I've said this before. I think, just to sympathize with you, I think this is a particular problem in social science. So both you, I'm a political scientist, you're a psychologist. We are both social scientists, and there is a problem with defining terms now. It's endemic, and it worries me. So I'll give you an example from my science, just to equalize the problem here, so we're not focusing on your science. But you know, there's this term populism, and everybody's talking about populism, and it's a very loaded term, and it's almost never defined, and it drives me nuts. And there are perfectly respectable, otherwise respectable political scientists who do this. They throw out populism is bad, and they never define it. And when challenged, like in your analogy, when challenged, they won't define it. So can we say that defining things is a fundamental part of the prescription? Shall we say to the audience, you must start by defining things. You challenge somebody to define things. If they cannot define things, shall we treat that as a default failure on their part? Would that be fair?
So I'm not, so the part that I'm not entirely convinced that it's useful to say that someone has failed in a conversation. It might be, I mean, I'm not saying that it's totally inappropriate, but I'm not sure it's useful. It might be more useful to say, okay, let's do this together. And you know, you're right. If one person says, I believe that this, and the other person says, well, I don't believe that, and the conversation is over, that's not very helpful. But I would also say that's not really a dialogue. They're not actually engaging with each other. And you know, it's not always trivially easy to engage with someone that you disagree with. And that's something that I think students really need practice with. I think we all need practice with that. And starting with definition, you know, that can be very helpful, but actually defining things is really hard. And actually we use lots of words that we have difficulty coming up with a definition for. Like, you know, it's not super easy to come up with a definition for dog, which is super concrete and straightforward, or a definition for love, which is a word that we use all the time. The problem, I would say, is if someone refuses to even try to define something. But the response to that isn't, okay, well, you failed and I'm not going to engage with you anymore. It's ideally, okay, well, let's see if we can come up with a definition that satisfies both of us, or at least a working definition. And maybe it's not complete, and maybe we'll have to revise it later as we sort of come upon new uses of it. or new ideas, but we need to find somewhere to start just so we can communicate. And if someone says, well, everyone knows what I mean, so I don't need to define it, say, well, I don't know what you mean, and I would really like to understand. And there may be some people who aren't willing to engage, and that does happen. And I think that's a problem. And that's why we need to change our education system to teach people how to engage and to get people in the habit of engaging constructively and actually and actively, not just insisting on their position. Because this takes practice. This is not super easy, and there are in fact lots of parts of our culture that teach people to do the opposite, to just stick to their position and say, this is what's true, this is the way the world is, and I don't need to listen to anyone else because I know that I'm right. And that's, I think our education system doesn't really do a great job of teaching people not to do that, to do other things, but I think that it could. And there are many teachers at all levels of education that do this really effectively.